Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Profitable Home Services Podcast. I'm so glad you could join with us today and listen in on this very important topic. Today, I'm happy to welcome back Rhamy Alajeal. Some of you may remember he was here a few months ago and talked to us about the importance of hiring and retaining people and what a costly profit leak that can be when we're not able to retain our people and we constantly have to hire and train. Well, today he's back to talk about some new rules that maybe you haven't thought about, rules that will affect if you have salaried employees. And so with that, I'd like to say, Rhamy, thank you so much for coming back again on the podcast and take it away. Give us a little summary of what's coming up. I know we've got some dates coming up very quickly on us.
That's right. And it's a pleasure as always. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, we have a pretty big change coming. So, for a little bit of history, to understand what's going on, in the United States, there was a law passed a long time ago, almost 100 years ago now, called the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA. And this was put in place as a response to the Great Depression, believe it or not. This is a long time ago. And it defined a minimum wage in the United States. We didn't have minimum wage before that. It also defined a 40-hour work week and said, hey, if you're working in the US and you work more than 40 hours, you're going to get overtime. And that was the law of the land. It applies by default to everybody in the country. It's been on the books for 100 years, and it's been updated throughout the years. One of the things they did right after they wrote the law was realized, hey, we need some exceptions to this law because loopholes are fun. They started off being really straightforward. For example, there's the business owner exemption. If you own more than 20% of the company, you don't have to pay yourself minimum wage or overtime. Makes a lot of sense.
What a concept, right?
Yeah, they realized they needed that loophole very quickly, or people would get in trouble. And then they added some more exceptions or exemptions to the law. And those exemptions include things like being a learned professional. If you're a scientist or engineer and you're supposed to work in a lab all day, every day, they said, all right, you're a genius. You're focused on a field of science or learning. And they made an exception for that. They said, but you got to make at least $4,000 a month. I'm sorry, $4,000 a year. They said, you got to make at least $4,000 a year. Otherwise, you're not a real scientist. A long time ago. And over the years, they've made more and more exceptions to this rule, right? So they made one for executives that said if you're a manager of more than 2 full-time people, you have the right to hire or fire them, and you make more than that $4,000 a year. Well, you're a boss, and I don't care if you get paid overtime. Those exceptions over the years have piled up. And that number, that minimum salary threshold, has been updated over and over throughout the years. Been a while, though. The last time this was attempted to be updated was under Obama, but there were some court challenges. He did it a little funky, and it wound up not going into effect. So currently, the rule is if you're exempt, if you're a exception to this Fair Labor Standards Act, you have to be an executive, a learned professional, an administrative employee, which is what a lot of our listeners are. You have to meet these job duties tests. You can't be a plumber. You can't be a construction worker. You got to be one of these accepted roles. And in each of those accepted roles, there's a minimum salary threshold. That threshold right now is $684 a week. That comes out to $35,568 per year. There is no one in the country who is exempt from overtime who makes less than $35,568 per year right now. If you've ever tried to hire somebody and put them on a salary of 20 grand a year, you can't do that. You can put them on a salary, but you still owe them overtime. You still have to track their hours. You still have to make sure they're being paid the minimum wage. You still have to make sure that if they work more than 40, you owe them overtime. To be exempt from overtime and minimum wage, you got to make more than that 35,568.
So it sounds like we should be tracking hours for our employees then in all positions.
Makes life a lot easier. It's tough sometimes when you've got, high-powered managerial people. I don't want to clock my hours, but it does make life a lot easier. For those people who aren't, you're not tracking their hours, they better be making more than 35,568, and they better be in one of those exempted roles. Administrative, learned professional, computer employee, one of those exemptions. Here's the big news. April 15th of this year, not too long ago, a rule was finalized, and it's increasing that minimum salary from $684 per week to $844 per week. That's a pretty big increase.
That's
Yeah.
a big jump.
Going from 35,568 all the way up to sorry, dings going on. 35,568 a year all the way up to 43,888 per year. And here's what's crazy. That's going into effect July 1 of 2024. So depending on when you're listening to this, it could be tomorrow, right? It could have been yesterday. This is a big deal. There is no one allowed to be salaried, exempt from overtime, that makes less than 43,888 per year starting July 1. And January 1 of 2025, not long from now, 6 months, that is increasing to 1128 per week, $58,656 per year.
That's
Let me repeat
almost
that.
double.
Yeah.
From where it currently
58,000.
sits.
That's right.
Wow.
35% of the people who are salaried in the Southeast United States are under that $58,000 line. 1/3 of salaried people in the South are going to have to get a raise or become hourly. That's what this law says.
Wow.
Okay.
That's going to be a huge ripple effect on small businesses.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Not just the fact that you're going to have to pay a lot more just for that position, but it also creates salary compression issues, right? Let's say that you used to start people at 40 and then you went to 43 and then 46 and 48 over the course of 4 years. Well, if you decide, well, dang, I'm just going to have to comply with this. I don't want to go hourly. I need salaried. And you move everybody to 58. Well, that's good. Except now you've got people who've been there 5 years and people you're hiring at the same rate. So you're not rewarding longevity. You're not rewarding the management of those people. That whole concept we call salary compression. So when you have to raise the minimum, you kind of got to raise the next couple steps. Otherwise, no one's going to want to lead anybody. So it's a pretty large financial cost. Now, you don't have to give raises. If you pay someone 40, say you got somebody on a salary at 40,000 a year right now, July 1, at the time of this recording, that's 24 days from now. They're not exempt anymore. You can change them to hourly.
Okay.
You can change them to hourly. And we have a tool which Diane will put as a downloadable on here. It's a little spreadsheet. You can type in their current salary, how many hours you think they're working a week right now, even if it's, say, 45, and it'll kind of calculate the overtime and give you what their new hourly rate should be to get them the same pay. Okay. But it varies, right? Yeah. If you say 45 hours a week and they only work 43, well, they're hourly. They're going to make less. Okay. But that's a solution, is to move them to hourly. Another solution could be to leave them at their salary, as is 40,000, but know that they are not exempt from overtime anymore. So what that means is you're going to have to track their hours, and in weeks where they work more than 40 hours, you got to pay them extra. Period. You can't do comp time. You can't say, well, they worked 2 hours extra this week. We're going to give them 2 hours off next week. That's not legal. You simply have to pay them overtime, like an hourly worker, which means if they work 35 hours, you're going to pay them their salary. If you work 40 hours, you're going to pay them their salary. But if they work 42, you get to give them more money.
So just for clarification, because this is not something that I think home service businesses really think about, is you can have salary people that are not exempt on the overtime rules.
That's right. That's right. Just because you give them a salary, that's a way of paying them. But the question is, do you comply with minimum wage and overtime? And overtime rules are based on their what they call regular rate of pay. So if you give them a salary, that's their regular rate. And then if they work over 40, you got to pay overtime, time and a half per hour.
And you have to calculate what that regular rate would be. Overtime, or their normal regular pay divided by 40 hours a week or whatever to come up with a subsequent hourly rate. Okay.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And good payroll companies can do that for you, but it just kind of puts you in a crap position because the weeks they work 30, you don't get any money back. But when they work 50, you get to pay for 55 hours.
Except for in those states where they have other requirements like per day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is a
Mhm.
federal law, and there are
Mhm.
many states that already have higher salary requirements, and they may have daily overtime requirements, which
Like
you would
California,
have to
yes,
comply with, right? Or
right?
even states like, so California, they have a minimum salary that's already really high. It's like 65 grand.
Wow.
There's nobody in California under, it may be 60. I don't have a number in front of me.
Mhm.
There's nobody under that already. But in Colorado, they don't have that minimum salary, but they do have daily overtime. And you're exempt from that at someone paying someone
Mhm.
40,000 a year right now. But suddenly you're going to have daily overtime to deal with if you
Wow.
don't increase this salary.
Mhm. So
So
there's
you
a
need,
lot to think about that
yeah,
this could affect.
that's right. You really have to decide, am I going to eat it and give the raises? And maybe you've got everybody over 58 already, and this doesn't matter to you. Maybe you've got a couple people at 53, 55, and it's like, this is just my new minimum.
Mm.
It is what it is. I need to give some raises up and down the board, and you've got the budget to make that work, in which case you were going to give them a raise next year anyway, right? It's not the end of the world. But if you're paying 40 and 43 and 41,
Mhm.
you've already got a problem in a couple weeks, and you're going to have a big problem in 6 months. And you got to decide if you can afford the extra. If they're at 40 right now, can you afford an extra $18,600 per salaried employee January 1?
And that doesn't count the extra payroll taxes. It doesn't count the extra workers' comp you're going to pay. It doesn't count any of
Disability
those
payments,
extra
all that stuff.
costs
Mhm.
that are associated with that salary.
That's right. That's right. In home services, um, another thing to, a number in the back of your head is in general, whatever you put on payroll in terms of gross wages, the back of the napkin number for a small business is about 35%. That covers your additional taxes, which is only, 10%, not even that high, depending on how much you pay in. Um, but workers' comp adding up to 7 cents, disability payments, short-term disability, long-term disability, life insurance, those are all based on salary normally. And then retirement plans and all those other pieces add up. If you look at large businesses, they're spending 40 cents. Smaller
Wow.
businesses are spending more like 30. If you look at your payroll and it's 100 grand, you're probably spending 130 on labor,
Easy,
PTO,
easy.
all that
Yes.
stuff. Mhm.
Yeah.
So what you need to do, you need to get a list of your salaried employees, write down their names, what their current salary is, estimate how many hours a week they're working, and then just make the determination on whether you're going to move them to hourly and prepare for that, have the conversation with them, or decide if you can afford to do the required raises. And if you're going to do raises, you need to think hard about what that means up the chain. People who are more senior, people who are managers of those people, et cetera, because you're probably going to have a little bit of a ripple effect that you need to work on
Right.
up the chart.
And I think so many of the home service businesses have experienced a tier of this coming out of COVID.
Mhm.
When prior to COVID, maybe they were getting a tech for 20 or 25 an hour, and post COVID, it's maybe 25 or 30 or even 35 an hour, depending on where they are across the US, that they're having to pay. And now we're talking just a short couple years later of having to add another amount to it.
That's right. That's right. Now, remember, techs are blue collar, right?
Right.
If they're
But
in
just
the
saying, but it's
field,
going to shift the whole payroll up
that's right.
with what
But
they
you're
cost their techs. And now we're going to hit their little management team
you're
and
hitting
have a
management.
similar,
Anybody in the
ripple up
office,
there.
anybody you're salaried right now, sales professionals. There are
Right.
some exemptions for purely outside commission only sales professionals.
Okay.
That's one of those kind of weird parts that the salary part doesn't apply to. But those are rare in the home services businesses.
Mhm.
Maybe if you have a roofing company and you got a guy who's just out in the field knocking doors
Mhm.
and they're paid pure commission, they're not the salaried people that we're talking about here.
Right.
But even if you have an inbound call lead person that you're paying a salary and they get a little bit of commission on top, something like that, those are the people you got to take a look at because they've got to make this minimum weekly amount and it can't be variable. Okay. Your variable compensation doesn't go into this. So if you have somebody who gets to this number some months because of extra commissions, things like that, that's not going to do it for you.
You're looking at that base rate.
Mhm.
Right. So I'm looking at this from this side of my head as the employer. This side of the head is what's this going to do to their bottom line profits? We took the hit on the blue collar type of workers and other workers as well. A couple years ago, now we're going to take another hit on our management team. What is that doing to their profit, to that bottom line profit that they're all trying so hard to protect and
Yeah.
keep a certain profit percentage?
Well, on some level, you just have to argue this is government imposed inflation, right?
Right.
Your
It
costs are going to
is.
go up.
Yep.
Everybody's costs are going to go up. It's not putting you at a competitive disadvantage. Everybody's going to wind up raising their
Yep.
costs.
Their
And
price
so,
books will have to be updated to absorb this and on from there, passing it on
exactly.
ultimately to the customer.
Which then, so what all you're doing is increasing the number of dollars, and
It is.
it doesn't do anything. Um, as a rule, when there are these sorts of things, it's the long run effect normally is nothing, right? Because
Right.
you're
But the
you're
short
forcing people to
term,
be paid more.
yeah,
But the short term, the business owner's in a real rough
they
position
are.
until the market adjusts.
Yeah, especially if they've not been thinking about this and not been planning for it. And all of a sudden, for them to catch this episode on the 1st of July and go, what is
That's
going
right.
on? How come I haven't heard about this? How come my payroll company or my accountant or somebody hasn't been telling me about this?
Yeah, it's really tough. And the way, regulations are getting rolled out left and right now means it's very difficult to stay on top of it. As we talked about, every state has their own regulation too.
Yes.
There have been around 20 changes to overtime, breaks, what we call attestation, which is a way of documenting breaks, and minimum wage, not including just regular minimum wage hikes, just 20 ways of calculating and doing all these things in just the last 6 months
Oh
across
my
the US.
goodness.
So it really does take a real dedicated team to keep track of this stuff. Or, tune into Diane's podcast and she'll keep you up to date too. But it's tough.
It is
What I would
tough.
say is, as a business owner right now, you always got to prioritize, right? So, step one, am I about to get screwed come July 1? You got to get in the position to not mess up here. The consequences of messing this up are significant. The consequence is you don't have records of how long someone worked. And they're not exempt from the FLSA, which means they're entitled to overtime, which means they can claim they're not being paid overtime. So if you got somebody at 40,000 right now for anything under 43,888, they're becoming hourly July 1 if you don't take action. You can leave them on a salary, but you're hoping to God that they don't have a way of saying, and you don't have a way of proving against them that they work 50 hours a week.
Now, when we
Because,
talked earlier offline, you were sharing a story about a company who had an issue that they ended up owing like $1 million in back wages.
oh
Can you
yeah,
share that story with our listeners?
sure. So this was a client of ours. They weren't a client at the time. They became one after this. Um, And what happened was they ran a very simple tire change and oil change shop. Okay. And they have, they know the guys who work on the cars. Those are supposed to be hourly guys. And they have managers. Those are fine. But they had receptionists. Okay. And the receptionist just answered the phone and did scheduling. Now they put those receptionists on salary. Those receptionists under the administrative exemption, this is a job duties test, not a salary test, but
Mhm.
under their job duties, you have to make decisions that require the exercise of discretion. These receptionists did not do that, right? They
Okay.
they 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 failed that job duties test, so they had them on salary. Well, they had a receptionist who was there for about a year. Um, they'd have 3 or 4 on staff at any given time. And after about a year, through a complicated series of reasons, they had to fire this employee. And it was not a friendly firing, right? It was one of those where you just got to let somebody go. On the drive home from the day she was fired, she heard an ad on her radio station from Morgan and Morgan, specifically saying, are you someone who's been working in a position where they didn't pay you overtime, but you know that other people like you get paid overtime? If your employer isn't paying you overtime correctly, call us now. We'll
Oh
check
my
it out.
goodness.
That easy. She called on the drive home. She met with a local attorney. Morgan and Morgan's like a franchise. There's hundreds of offices. And they did a little intake on her, and they wanted to know, what's your job? What is it you did? And the duties that she had did not qualify her for a salary exemption. She should have been hourly. They immediately filed intent to sue, a preservation of documents order, which means don't delete anything. And then under the discovery process, required that the employer produce all of their payroll records and a list of every employee terminated for the last 7 years.
Ouch.
They didn't go under her suit. They went through every employee terminated and got 12 people who were in receptionist roles over the last 7 years and got them all together. And then they sat down and they sat in a conference room and they all agreed that they worked on average 60 hours a week. 10-hour shift, 6 days a week. Is complete BS. There's no way.
Right.
But they alleged that these 10 employees, for their entire periods of employment, worked 60 hours a week. They were being paid a salary. And I don't remember what the salary amount was. It was not bad. It was 45, 50,000. It was above the salary threshold in some of this case. But the job duties test said they weren't supposed to be salaried. They alleged that they were owed not 20 hours extra of pay, half their pay for the whole year, but 30 because of overtime, right? 20 at time and a half. So they wanted 75% of their annual pay plus penalties for their entire working careers for 12 employees over the course of 7 years.
That business owner had to have been
I found this on
devastated.
the web.
$1.2 million. It was the number that came up with.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. They settled for 1 million. Good on them. Because they felt it was a slam dunk, and it was. If it had gone to trial, they'd have gotten probably two.
Right.
Because they would have gotten the 1.2 plus penalties and all that kind of stuff. Because they had no
Legal
records.
fees.
Yeah, they had no records. They had no records. You have to know, if they're not exempt, you have to know how many hours they work, because otherwise they're going to pretend that they worked 150 hours every week. They just live there. You keep them in the basement and they come out in the morning and they work until midnight and they go back to sleep. And you have no way of proving otherwise. You're going to have a bad day eventually when you piss someone off enough to call Morgan and Morgan. So starting July 1, no one's salaried under 43,888. If they are, you need to be tracking their hours. You owe them overtime. You owe them overtime. If you don't pay them overtime, you're going to owe them that overtime plus late payments and taxes and penalties. Okay? You're not paying your people appropriately. Look over your spreadsheet. Bigger issue, because probably the difference between 35,568 and 43,888, there's probably not a whole lot of people here. Hopefully there aren't that many between 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. Those people you got to address now.
Yeah.
The bigger issue is by January 1, you're moving that number up to 58,656 per year. And there's a lot of people under that number. Those are the ones you got to prep. Yeah.
Right. That probably encompasses the majority of the management in a home service business, or somewhere in that range.
It's 35% of all salaried employees in the South. I mean, that's a lot, especially when you think there's a lot of salaried people at 200 and 300 and 400.
Yeah. Those don't count, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 35% is a lot. 35th percentile is a lot of people. So you're going to have to make a decision on whether you want to go hourly and realize that means some variable pay. It means some more pay on busy weeks and some less pay on others. Whether you want to keep them on a salary but pay them overtime, which is where you're going to take the risk that they work over 40. But if they work less than 40, they get paid the same. Or you want to keep things the same in terms of management. That means you got to raise their salaries significantly and their boss's salary.
The big decisions looming here that need to be
That's right.
addressed. Yes.
And whatever you decide, communication is key, right? How you communicate this. If you've got somebody who's been salaried for a long time, they're going to hate clocking in and out, right? They're going to say, this is a problem. I don't want to, this is, and you got two kind of communication strategies. I'll give you a hint. One is blame Biden, right? Just put it on the government. It's the government's fault. Look,
It's all their
it
fault.
just
Yep.
is what it
They make
is.
a good scapegoat.
That's right. They make a good scapegoat.
Mhm.
Alternatively, you could simply blame the government and require everybody to clock in and out, including your remaining salaried people, people at 80,000, 100,000, 150,000. It's a good move. Keeping people clocked in and out, even though it feels a little weird as an executive, it gives you so much insight as a business owner into what's going on in your company. You may have an administrator who makes 60,000 a year right now, who's working 60 hours a week every week. And you're either going to burn them out or they're the most loyal human in the world and they're going to keep rocking for you, but eventually they're going to get sick. And then you're going to need to know that this isn't a one full-time person kind of position. You're probably going to need two people to replace someone that
More than
dedicated,
likely, right?
right? You need that insight and also to intervene. My director of client services, she's been with me coming up on 8 years. And, about 4 years in, I had to sit down with her because she had been working 55, 60, 65 hours every week for a year since she got her promotion. And I begged her why. And it's because she's an amazingly dedicated, talented person. I want her, and she wants to get off work at 5 when everybody else does, and then go eat dinner with her kids and then come back. And she works for 3 more hours. But I never would have known if I didn't require her clocking in and out, right? So I have to have that insight so that I can say, all right, well, at least take 2 weeks off, a couple times more. Okay,
Do something, right?
let's make sure that we're protecting you and your family. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my top employee. Okay.
Right.
So have everybody clock in and out, or um, really push that this is just an administrative requirement. Those are your communication strategies. That's if you're moving people to hourly.
Well, thank you so much for unpacking this really not so great news
It's
for all of us that have salary employees.
yeah, it's been a wild, just the last 2 months we've had this, and also all non-competes in the country have been banned.
Yes.
So it's been they're using that executive pen. They're getting their work in. um, so we just have to adapt to it. If you need help with this, that's what my company does. We serve as an HR department for other companies. So everything from an executive at that business partner level, coming up with the strategies, keeping an eye out in the future, making the plans so that you can scale and grow your operations, to day-to-day management, contacts for your managers and employees to call in and talk with us and meet with us, be their HR person, to those specialists, compliance experts, tax experts, benefits and compensation designers who make sure you're paying appropriately, leave experts, all that stuff. That's what we do. So you can always reach out to us. Diane and I work very closely. So you work with her, you'll like working with us. And I think, Diane, one thing we'll have as a downloadable is my understanding. I've got all this summarized, all these updates
Oh, good.
summarized on a one pager for you. And I've
Okay.
got a spreadsheet that we calculate. You can I told you that spreadsheet, just type in their names, salaries and hourlies, and it'll give you all your options, tell you what the
Okay.
salary rate would be or what the salary raise needs to be and when. And we'll make both of those available as a downloadable on here.
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that, Rhamy, because I think we're going to have some people that were driving or something while they're listening to this, and now they got these numbers all jumbled around in their head. But if they'll just go out and look at the show notes, it'll be attached down there, and you can get that clarity that you need on what these numbers are and then make the decisions appropriate. But thank you again so much for coming back on the podcast and sharing this very, very timely information that we can get right out there and make some decisions and decide the direction we're heading with our salary people.
That's right. Hey, none of us are big enough fish to change the law, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
So we just have to react and make sure our companies are the ones that succeed and thrive during this, right?
Right.
Here's what I can tell you. Half your competitors are going to screw it up.
They will.
Right.
Oh, you bet they will,
Right?
especially because they're not listening to this podcast.
That's right. That's right. So this is every time one of these crazy things comes down, it's an opportunity to differentiate your company and realize that, 1 out of 5 of your competitors in the next year or two are going to get caught up with this bad. So being ahead of the curve is better than being behind it. So So
You bet.
good job
And
listening in.
yes, thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this episode. Remember, we want you to stay profitable, and we will catch you on the next episode.